Okay, thank you for IEMed to allow this meeting and this lecture with Professor Paul Tabar. Initially, this lecture was in person because this is the philosophy that we are trying to follow, fighting against the coronavirus and the pandemic. But this time it has not been possible because Professor Tabar is in Australia and for different reasons, but basically the Australian government make some prevention for the coronavirus. It was impossible to be with us, but in any case, technically it's possible to be there. And we are very grateful that IEMed allow us to organize this seminar, much needed seminar, and for us it was very important to have this Lebanese dimension in our master. You know that this lecture belongs also to the seminar series of Greeting and linked to EuromedMich. EuromedMich is a network of researchers in the Mediterranean working on migration. And this seminar will be recorded with the authorization of Paul Tabar and will be also distributed through EuromedMich website. I am very grateful that all the students from Master Migration Studies are already there. I guess that other public from IEMed is also there. And nothing more to say that maybe technically that after the lecture of Professor Tabar, we can receive some questions. But the question cannot be done orally, but only writing questions in the Q&A section. In Zoom, you have this possibility to write questions, and then me, as a chair of this session, will have also the possibility to read and to pose and to formulate this question, also to summarize all the questions we will receive, hopefully, to Professor Tabar. The lecture will take maybe half an hour, 40 minutes, and after that, a debate will take place. And I warmly request the audience not to be shy, because it is a writing and pose question. It is a very good and very great opportunity to have with us Professor Tabar, Paul Tabar, from the Lebanese American University in Beirut, in spite of being now in Australia, as I said. We have a very good lecture on transnational and diaspora, and the provocative title, I hope we will have some light about this provocative title, that Transnationalism is not diasporic, the Austrian-Lebanese community, national belonging in the age of globalization. Just a few words about the biography of Paul Tabar, but you have already the information that we sent to you announcing this lecture. But Paul Tabar is director of the Institute for Migration Studies and professor in sociology and anthropology at the Lebanese American University in Beirut campus. He's author also of Migration and Formation of Political Elite in Lebanon, Arab Center of Research and Policy Studies, and Arab Communities in Australia. He is also the co-author on Being Lebanese in Australia, Identity, Racism, and Ethnic Field, that I highly recommend for the Institute of Migration Studies, and Bin Laden in the Suburbs, Criminalizing the Arab Other. He has also other writings that you can also see in the website. He is now currently working on Lebanese diasporic communities and the diasporic public activities. He's also working on 2 books projects, one on migrant habitus. I see here the Bourdieu, migrant habitus focusing on second generation, and other on social inequalities in Lebanon using Bourdieusian perspective. Dr. Tabar has published many articles on Lebanese and Arab migrants in international journals. He's also editor of book series on migrant studies and collaboration with Professor Anton Escher, Johannes Gutenberg in the University of Mainz. Very grateful that he takes some opportunity. I think in Australia is around 8 evening, and I hope you will have possibility to have a dinner on time. But grateful also for your family, and because I know that these things happen. I'm very happy to. This Bourdieusian dimension. I was myself with Bourdieu when I was young for 1 year with him in l'École des Études, and I'm very pleased to have Bourdieu with us also. And most of the analytical tools that he delivers us are now used also for migration studies and make sense, I will say, from this side. Then I am myself excited to listen to you and maybe participate also in the debates. Thank you again for Professor Tabar to be with us.
Thank you, Ricard, for this gentle and generous introduction. Hello, everyone. On the other end of this globe, the northern part, I am in the southern hemisphere. It is, as has been mentioned, 8 o'clock at night here, which is still okay. You know, I had other Zoom meeting much later due to the time difference. I am really pleased and to have this opportunity to talk to you. It would have been, I must admit, much more exciting to me, at least, had I been able to be present physically and experience this interaction with you on a closer range rather than through Zoom. Just to give you an idea, by way of introducing the topic I'm going to talk about, you know, I am myself a migrant. I was 17 when I came to Australia in 1971. I did not know the English language. You know, at the time, Lebanon was predominantly Francophone, and I was educated and had some schooling in a school which taught Arabic and French. Not, you know, like a school for high class and upper middle class people, but reasonable for my education to be okay at the end of the day. When I came to Australia, I had to continue my studies, work and continue my studies like typically any other, I would say, migrant family. Ended up doing a philosophy degree at Macquarie University in social philosophy, writing my honors thesis on actually a European philosopher at the time who was very popular and highly debatable, his work. His name is Louis Althusser. And then decided to change to sociology and anthropology, in which discipline I did my PhD, and it was actually a PhD on Lebanon. I'm saying this not to bore you with my stories, but to give you an idea that here is someone who came with his family, parents and siblings to Australia, wanted to go and study, and seems that even the choice that I have taken in my postgraduate studies was somehow shaped by my migrant background. I picked up the topic of my home country at a time when Lebanon was coming out from a 15 years old civil war, and finished my PhD with the ending of the civil war actually in 1989. But ever since then, I sort of like developed a very sort of like peculiar interest in studying migration in Australia and migrant communities. And I was very much interested in the question of racism and settlement and diversity and multiculturalism, because Australia was a pioneer state along, as you probably know, Canada, that in 1973, 2 years after my arrival, a Labour government under the leadership of Gough Whitlam decided to adopt multiculturalism and started calling Australia a multicultural society instead of emphasizing about its colonial white background, and started to dismantle, if you wish, the white Australia policy, which I guess we are still struggling with. And in that context, I really developed a very much focused interest on migration in the country of destination, migrant communities in the country of destination. And then decided to go to Lebanon, which opened up the opportunity for me to start studying migration from the sending country. Lebanon being a good example of a country which has a large number of its population, double the number of its current population, who have left Lebanon over the years, starting, I would say, from the last quarter of the 19th century, and settled in various parts of the world. In that context, I started to develop much more interest in, if you want, what happened to the sending country when it is experiencing emigration, and what again happens to the relationship between those who leave and those who are left behind. And one interesting, which is by now taken for granted in the literature on migration, one interesting issue was, how can we really get rid of the so-called methodological nationalism, i.e. Studying societies, whether it is a sending society or a receiving society, or it is a sending and a receiving society at the same time. When studying that society, how can we get rid of the bias in the literature, in the sense that when we study that particular society, we tend to ignore migration or consider it to be an appendix and not part and parcel of what is going on within the nation state, within the state itself and the society itself. And I think by now, if I'm sure you are familiar with the literature which had sort of like settled its account with this methodological nationalism, this bias that we call methodological nationalism, the method whereby we take the nation as the unit of analysis, as an independent unit of analysis, ignoring its cross-national relations. Now, and here I think another step by the way of conceptual clarification, which I wanted to make sure that I pass on to you. And this step has to do now with the concept of transnationalism and the concept of diaspora or diasporic relations versus transnational relations. In the literature, and still up till now, I guess, that you read on migration, I found that there is a lot of confusion between the two, and the two concepts, diaspora and transnationalism, are used interchangeably. And at a time when I believe that the two concepts must be separate and differentiated in terms of each one having peculiar characteristics, even though they overlap. And I think what is important in this regard is to say the following, that diasporic relations and diasporic activities and diasporic engagement, especially in the public sphere, in affairs that relate to public issues, in the sphere that relates to public issues, are relations oriented to the country of origin of those who are engaged in these activities. by contrast, transnational relations are relations and transnational activities are relations and activities which are not necessarily oriented to one particular country, let alone be it the country of those who are engaged in transnational activities and transnational relations. In fact, transnational activities are oriented to the globe. And here I can, people refer when they sometimes talk about transnationalism and transnational politics, they refer to, let's say, peace movement, movement for the protection of the environment, you know, a world free of nuclear power type of movement, movement against the war, and so on and so forth. These issues and the orientations of those who are involved in these issues are really not confined to one particular country. And those who are engaged in these issues may be drawn from different countries and different national and ethnic background. Whereas, by contrast, if you look at the people involved in diasporic relations, you find out that they are mainly motivated by a common ethnic or national identity. So it might be the case sometimes, of course, that some people would support, let's say, the Lebanese migrants' call for, let's say, the expulsion of Syrian soldiers. And those people supporting the Lebanese migrants calling for that abroad might not necessarily be Lebanese, but the majority of those engaged in such activities, which are directed specifically to public issues, political issues in Lebanon, are of Lebanese background and are driven by their Lebanese-ness, if you wish, or diasporic Lebanese identity in order to engage primarily in that activity. Now, talking about these differences, I think would warrant us to call for a conceptual differentiation between transnationalism and diasporic relations. And even though I must admit, of course, that there is an overlap between the two, in the sense that all diasporic relations are, at the end of the day, transnational relations. There are relations that cuts across national borders, but not all transnational relations are diasporic relations, and hence the need to distinguish and differentiate between the two by reference to the main 2 points that I have explained a while ago. The other thing that I find interesting is that transnationalism, by way of elaborating more on transnationalism, transnationalism and transnational activities, I find Portes, an American, Latin American background professor of sociology in the United States, making a distinction which I find useful between transnational activities and globalization. And he says transnational activities are to be differentiated from globalization, in the sense that transnational activities are, sort of grassroots activities by masses, by people, by opposition. Globalization is more to refer to, let's say, relations that are transnational but are engaged, are relations produced by corporations, global corporations, and big companies, multinational companies, and so on and so forth. So globalization is more like the work, if you wish, you would say, of governments, of private sector, big corporations, multinational companies, financial institutions, whereas transnationalism more to do with grassroots type of activities. So that's the first point that I wanted to make in my lecture by way of clearing the ground conceptually for what I'm going to talk about. Now, the other thing that I find interesting in the literature, as a matter of fact, is the talk about remittances. And we all know that whenever we talk about remittances, what comes to mind first and foremost is financial remittances, that migrants do remit financially to their country of origin, either to their relatives or families, or by way of investing back home and making some investment. Or, you know, sometimes they return themselves, you know, with all the remittances and all the capital that they have accrued and actually invest in the country of origin. And in this regard, it is due to the work of Peggy Levitt, the anthropologist, that we have started to use a distinction between financial remittances and social remittances. Now, I think when Peggy Levitt, which I have referred her work to you in the list of references of the lecture notes that I have sent out to you in writing, she actually made this important distinction between social remittances and financial remittances. Now, saying that, first let me say that there is no pure social and no pure economic remittances, because economic remittances are also remittances that have social dimension to it. And, you know, for instance, when I send money, let's say to my parents back home, as a simple question, as a simple issue that you find very much familiar and widespread among migrants supporting their parents back home. In fact, it's not purely a matter of sending money, but also because of the assumed and implied social value that I have about my family and the derived obligations that I do have towards my parents that make me really make that particular financial remit or transfer. And in that sense, there is no pure economic remittance, but predominantly economic. We say there are, you know, financial remittances. Predominantly, they are financial because you know, people send money. But I thought that it would be important to draw your attention to the fact that there is no pure financial remittances. By the same token, when we refer to social remittances, again, social remittances, even though they are primarily about practices, values, views, decisions, position taking, and so on and so forth by migrants, which are shaped by migration and the presence and the settlement of migrants abroad, and are transferred back home through various means, you know, in the past through letters, and nowadays through social media, and so on and so forth. Again, social remittances as such are not purely social, because they might have economic ramifications. For instance, if I am a person who have left Lebanon, coming from originally a rural community in the mountains of Lebanon, where the emphasis on the female members of the family is not so much made for them to have and gain higher education, but rather the emphasis is on the boys and not the girls in the family. And I send money because I have acquired the importance of education, not only for male, but also for female. And I get in touch with my parents and tell them, look, my little sister ought to continue her education. I'm sending, by telling them this, social remittances, especially if I manage to convince them, and they get convinced, because at the end of the day, I'm going to participate in funding her education. And then by convincing them in doing so, in allowing and giving the opportunity to my sister to go and continue her education, they will end up supporting her financially, and I will end up supporting her financially. So social remittances can also have, I'm taking this simple example to prove the point, but it is also applicable and found and encountered in many other social remittances, the financial aspect to it. That's the second point about remittances. The third point about remittances is that, as I was actually reading more enthusiastically and passionately about the concept of social remittances, and experiencing at the same time, when I was doing that reading, it just happened that migrants in Lebanon were very much interested in political engagement back home. I thought that one should not include all non-financial remittances under the rubric of social remittances, that social remittances themselves ought to be differentiated. And I argued in my paper at the time for a differentiation between political and social remittances. For political remittances, especially if you are aware of the fact that there are differentiations in the structure of society, where certain institutions and practices are mainly political and other institutions and practices and associations are social in nature, and so on and so forth, you realize that there is a need to make this distinction, because you can't lump them together and make a good analysis about the impact of each on particular institutions to which they belong. So the two, if you wish, ought to be distinguished because they have different roles and have an impact on different differentiated institutions and associations in society. So I thought that, political remittances is an interesting concept to be distinguished and separated conceptually from social differences. Now, this leads me to the next important point that I want to share with you, i.e., it has to do with Bourdieusian concept of society, which he sees and analyzes in terms of fields. And he talks about each field as a set of power relations where actors in that field compete with one another in order to do two things. One, to accumulate more capital in that field. So if you're talking about economic field, you talk about accumulating wealth and money more and more. And the other competition and struggle may take the form of defining and giving new terms to the definition of the capital of that field. For instance, if you are considering making money and investing money in the private capitalist economy as representing the legitimate and most important capital over which people should compete and get more of it. If you are, let's say, a socialist, you might be challenging the concept of what makes up a capital legitimate and argue for, let's say, public capital, or undermining the concept of capital as represented by the capitalist and the capitalist system. And the same applies to other fields, in as much as we have a field. But before I go to the other field, I want to add that because of this competition and the distribution of capital unequally between the actors of the field, you end up having, of course, social inequality and differential power relations in the field, depending on the volume of capital that you are possessing. So you have subordinate people and dominant people with more capital versus less dominant or subordinate people with less capital, and so on and so forth. Now, in other fields as well, Bourdieu, the interesting point about Bourdieu is that he, in that analysis, I would argue, he keeps away from falling into the methodological trap of reductionism that many Marxists, if you wish, in the literature of classical Marxism, fall into by reducing the political ultimately to the economic, and by reducing the social ultimately to the economic. And Bourdieu would add also reducing the cultural to the economic, and I'll talk in a moment about the cultural. And he wants to see that there are separate fields, even though we'll talk later about the interaction between the various fields. But in talking about separate fields, he also talks about different capitals. So if you talk about political field, then you have a political capital. And if you talk about a state field, then you have a state power capital or state capital. And that, again, the distribution of the capital in each field is unequal, and you have power relations and struggle, not only over the possession of more capital, political capital, becoming the leader in a particular political field, or becoming a follower, or someone who opposes completely the dominant political capital and wants to redefine it in terms of different politics, being also, again, challenging and subordinate to the dominant form of capital. The same applies to social capital. Social capital here is about, connectivity and who you know, and the mobilization of the network that you have in order to gain more reputation within the social field. So if you wish, the social capital is equivalent to the Weberian concept of status. And status is a basis of unequal relationship, socially speaking, between the actors in the social field. And the capital here, again, is made up of the legitimate social status that people fight for, and that people sometimes fight in order to change and introduce a different form of social capital upon which a new relations of power will be created. And cultural capital, quickly speaking, is about qualifications and diploma, especially in advanced modern capitalist societies, where people with knowledge, and who are professionals, possess a lot of cultural capital, and people who are less educated or not educated with absolutely no cultural capital as well. So the importance of Bourdieu in that sense is that he restores, if you want, relative autonomy to each aspect of the social life, and invites the reader to see the specificity of each aspect before we can talk about the relationship of the different aspects. And therefore, the relations is not reductionist, not a simple reflection of the economic, but rather it has its own dynamics. Let's say the social capital or the political capital, it has its own dynamics, and it has its own investment, and it has its own actors, political parties, talking about the political field. And at the end of the day, of course, they do interact and affect each other. And sometimes, and he says the interesting point, next point that he makes here, is that capital are convertible. In other words, if I have a lot of money, I can use my money to earn a lot of cultural capital, send my kids to the best education, schools and universities. I can probably afford to enter politics, as in the case of Lebanon, of many returnee or return migrants who made a lot of money and were able to deliver and provide for social services, charitable associations within their own region and community, building a high social status, which they have used to turn into what is called, in Bourdieusian term, first a personal political capital and then a delegated political capital, whereby you are elected and you become a political leader. So the conversion and the convertibility between capital is one form of the relationship between them. And the second form of the relationship between them is which one is the more powerful in the field of power, which according to Bourdieu is the mother of all field, and which mediates the state as an official institution for imposing its domination over the social order. So do we have the economic power trying to become the most dominant power in society by using the state to express its wish and intention to dominate over the social order in general? Or do we have cultural power, cultural capital? The educated, the elite want to stand off and create some sort of a distance. Now, normally, the capital that is the competing capital and the power relations between them is determined and set by the state, because the state is the, if you wish, the agency which sets the terms of exchange between capital. Which one is more valuable and more valorized than the other, and how much I can buy with this capital another form of capital, and so on and so forth. I am saying this to you first to confirm and the importance and the significance of looking at society in terms of differentiated fields and differentiated social relations, and then ask the question about the relationship between these differentiated fields and differentiated institutions within society. Second, I am using Bourdieu because Bourdieu problematizes these different forms of fields and talks about who's doing what and what is the purpose within each field for the actors who are engaged in the field. So using what I call the fields lens gives us insights into the field and the differentiated fields and impose some sort of conceptual order on our analysis and depthness, insightfulness into what we are studying, than simply talking a la Peggy Levitt style, even though she is not highly simply descriptive in her analysis, but not deep enough and conceptually insightful enough compared to someone who uses the Bourdieusian lens in trying to understand social remittances, let alone trying to understand political remittances. And here we are talking about diaspora. I would like to use Bourdieu to introduce the concept of diasporic field. And diasporic field is a field, as I mentioned earlier, of people who are engaged in activities oriented towards their country of origin and are driven and have a shared, more or less, identity that belongs to the country of their origin. And the engagement that the diasporic actors are engaged in create many subfields, if you wish, within the diasporic field. They can engage economically, politically, socially, and culturally. And I believe this lens and this conceptual perspective helps us a lot to put some conceptual order and understanding on diasporic activities than otherwise, than simply, talking about, people are interested and they send social remittances and political remittances, and they send money, financial remittances to their homeland, and they demonstrate and they fight. One can talk a lot about their activities in a descriptive manner, but when you introduce the concept of a diasporic field, you then are talking about, first of all, the specificity of the diasporic relations and activities. Second of all, you are talking about what defines the legitimate and valorized diasporic activities versus non-valorized diasporic activities. Because those who are in the diaspora are not all in agreement normally about what they should remit to their country of origin. Some people would like to remit concepts, political concepts and political practices which are not in line with the dominant political capital back home, or which is not in line with the dominant concept of, at the time of our talk, with the dominant concept of the diasporic, sub-political diasporic capital within the diaspora. So a fight within the sub-political diasporic capital can be encountered between people who are engaged with a particular concept of what constitute a legitimate and valorized, in the language of Bourdieu, political capital, and what is not legitimate and challenging political capital from the diaspora towards home. And then comes how this remitted political capital by the diaspora is received back home. Because at the end of the day, the state is, as I said, the regulator, which accepts and rejects, which puts limit to how much your remittances are accepted politically and are not rejected or accommodated for, and so on and so forth. So all of that are, if you wish, possible to think about and to problematize by using, I would argue, the Bourdieusian conceptual tool of field, capital, valorization, and so on and so forth. These are, if you wish, the conceptual notes that I wanted to share with you before I quickly end by talking a bit about the Lebanese Australian or Australian-Lebanese diasporic community in Australia as a good example of what I'm talking about. And it doesn't only, believe me, apply to the Lebanese migrants in Australia, but to Lebanese across the world, and also to many migrant communities, whether in the past or in the present. But let me use the case of the Lebanese in Australia. Now, we all know that the Lebanese emigration started in the last quarter of the 19th century to Australia. And in the actual latest census, which took place in 2016, it was found that about 76,500 people are born in Lebanon, and 230,880 people claim a background from ancestry from Lebanon, and that 70 of the Lebanese are in Sydney and 20% are in Melbourne, the two major cities in that country. And any quick observation of what the Lebanese are doing in Australia, we can easily find that they have many community organizations, including political organizations. And given the type of politics in Lebanon, which is not completely, if you wish, which is not completely free from communal considerations and communal subnational loyalties, you don't only have branches of political parties, which are mainly in Lebanon sectarian political parties, i.e. with a religious identity being politicized, but also you have associations being formed, which are village associations and family associations and religious associations, who, in line with politics a la Lebanese style, are also used for political purposes. So, what I'm trying to say is that the Lebanese in Australia have developed a very rich field, diasporic field, which is engaged partly in home politics. People in Australia who are engaged in home politics are divided between those who support the system and those who are opposing the system. And those who are supporting the system are also divided between, various sectarian political groups. And those who are opposing the system of late, if you wish, can be referred to as the supporters of the October 17 uprising, which happened in 2019. And it is unfolding still in Lebanon, calling for a change in the regime and a reform in the regime, and calling to overthrow the political elite, mainly with all its sectarian composition and parties. So the struggle is at its highest point in the diasporic field. If you take Australia as an example, sub-political diasporic field, not only at the level of the parties in control of the regime as a whole, each one wanting a bigger share of the cake in terms of power distribution, but also it is a competition and a struggle between those who are completely against the regime versus those who are with the regime. Now, remitting is highly found as well. People send money, people send donations in kind, people demonstrate in the streets, and we've seen demonstration in the wake of the 2019 October 17 uprising, more than one demonstrations. We've seen many associations being formed by young people in support of this party or that party. And all the activities implied and undertaken by these different groups is quite wide in its range. As I said, in terms of money, in terms of lobbying, sometimes the Australian government or the local MP in support of a cause which is raised by a political party back home, in support of a particular issue, such as fighting the corruption and taking politicians who are corrupt to international tribunal because the justice system in Lebanon is not trusted. So, for instance, there is a very famous group in England, London, and in France, Paris, working on this to take politicians to justice via international justice court. So so many things, as I said, and all of these activities, by using the Bourdieu's in the framework, which I have explained, can make more sense, because then you can understand to what extent they are impactful back home, to what extent they are challenging the dominant political culture and political institutions, and what contribution in particular the diaspora activists can make in the overall political field back home, and so on and so forth. All these questions are only made possible and can be answered if you use a Bourdieusian perspective. I wish that my lecture had been useful, and that enough, at least by way of introduction to my ideas, have been said for you to ask all sorts of questions. And now I'm ready for you to raise these questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul, for this wonderful lecture. And as you say, combines perfectly the conceptual and empirical dimension. I really appreciate your analytical distinction and the use of Bourdieu that makes sense. Most of the analytical tools that he provides to us to this particular and empirical reality of diaspora, transnationalism, and so forth. Even if he had no time, I will say, to apply that in this particular case. We open the floor for the question now. Please do not hesitate to formulate questions. There are the conceptual and maybe the empirical side has been less details. Maybe we can request more details about how to put in practice this conceptual tools and this framework, this Bourdieu framework in the analysis of Lebanon, Lebanese people in Australia, and so on and so forth. Please do not hesitate to formulate questions. We have already one.
Yes.
Maybe I can begin with one. Israel Giselman is a student from the Master Studies, and she formulated something that I was myself thinking about. It is about, okay, we speak about remittances, we speak about political and social remittances, and this kind of distinction are very important and make sense. I guess that one of the questions related to Rael Giselman is if political remittances from the Lebanese diaspora influence Lebanese society in the past years. So what is the impact, I will say, of the Lebanese remittances, political remittances to the Lebanese society in general?
Yes.
Maybe this part of the outcome of the impact has maybe less been detailed in your lecture, and does
Yes.
make sense to pose this kind of questions.
Yes. My answer to this is that thanks for the questions, because it invites me to talk a little bit more about this in more empirical terms. We all know that Lebanon, like many other countries, give the right to Lebanese diaspora to vote from abroad. They have practiced this right in the last election, which was held in 2018, and it's going to be happening next year in the next election. In Lebanon, general elections are held every 4 years. Now, studies have shown, and I have actually done an empirical study on the contribution of Lebanese in Australia in the general election of 2008. And I found in this instance that those who have participated in the election back in 2009 from Australia were approximately 12,000 voters. And at the time, there was no law allowing the Lebanese abroad to vote from abroad. What happened instead is that political parties and people who were enthusiast supporters of these parties either were funded by the political parties to go to Lebanon and participate in the election, or they funded themselves and went down to Lebanon and participated in the election. So 12,000 approximately, they were distributed over many electoral districts, and it was found by my empirical examination that they made a difference in at least 4 seats in the case of Australia. Had it not been for them, it would have been a different results, in other words. The 2018 study showed that in the majority of cases, they did not make a difference, but they add more weight to those who won already the seats by the national count of the votes. In the upcoming election, we don't know yet, but it looks like the last election, the people who were registered from abroad to vote numbered 93,000. This time, because I think of the October uprising of 2019, the number who are registered is 244,442 people. And we are expecting that out of those who were registered in the last election, only 45,000 officially casted their vote. If the same number would cast their votes this time, it would mean, let's say, about 50,000 out of 200 and to round the figure 50,000. And 200,000, let's say another 100 don't vote, they simply registered but did not vote. There is 100 at least thousand voters who are registered, I think, against the regime, to vote against the regime. So why I'm trying to say this in anticipation and based on past analysis of the past 2 elections, I want to say that political remittances in this instance are measurable. So you have measurable political remittances, okay, in terms of impact, and you have unmeasurable political remittances. The unmeasurable ones are hard to measure, and over and above, it would take someone to apply a long durée methodology over a long period of time to examine the impact of values and practices, political practices and values on the receiving society. It is not a matter of like, you know, a year or 2, but you have to take it over a longer period of time and examine, given the political remittances which are unmeasurable and are sent during that period, what kind of impact is it having on the views and the practices back home? So it's a question that can only be answered by fieldwork, by taking fieldwork and doing empirical study over a long period of time. But the measurable one, in terms of money, which is measurable, sending money and donations, in terms of lobbying, and in terms of voting, they are measurable and they can be assessed. Now, have they made any difference? As I said, in terms of measurable political remittances, they did, to some extent, taken Australia as a case study. I haven't seen any study conducted on other places in certain seats. In the 2019, they did not, except they gave more weight to the already decided locally type of election. In the upcoming one, I anticipate much more impact because of the higher number of those who are registered. But in any case, one cannot anticipate that the diaspora would be able on its own to execute and implement change. This is idealistic, obviously. The diaspora can only help and contribute. The degree of help and contribution is to be empirically decided each time we study a particular case. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, for this concrete answer to concrete questions, and that's made clear that one of the challenges, methodological challenges of this field of research is how to measure or how to measure the impact. You speak about the impact in general, but also the democratic impact. So sometimes we have this kind of discussion also in classes. There is also some question coming from Tatiana Rodriguez. I think you already answered one part of the questions related to vote. But there is another question related to citizenship and basically to the descendants of Lebanese people, if they take citizenship, and how far the new generation follow these transnational remittances or not in relation to the parents. And I guess this is what is in the Tatiana Rodriguez mind when she posed the question: do descendants of Lebanese usually want to have a Lebanese citizenship in order to continue to have the political capital? And maybe I give you another question coming from another student, Henry Manning. How connected would you say most Lebanese living in Lebanon feel to members of the Lebanese diaspora? And relations, social relation between both. Would they consider all members of the diaspora to be Lebanese, members of the national community? Do home country diaspora linkages vary dramatically between different subnational groups? Very concrete questions, maybe related also to the diaspora concept that maybe need also some clarification in your lecture, because we have the transnational very clear, but diaspora maybe need some clarification, conceptually clarification that maybe it's behind also the end remaining questions. I have other questions, but maybe I leave you these two questions before, okay. And then I will jump to other questions that arise also in the Q&A box. Paul, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the two questions, which are actually related in a way. I just want to say by initially indicating that we live in a different world to the world, let's say, pre-1980. Obviously, everyone knows that the difference is due to globalization and to the degree of interconnectedness that globalization have brought to us and to people across the world. And not only that, but even pre-1980, I would say even the ideology of the various states across the world, as far as migration and dealing with migrants who come to these states are concerned, it was based on assimilationism. Basically, you come and you get assimilated, you give up your culture. That was at least the anticipation of the official state and the official policy. Hence white Australia policy and so on and so forth. Everyone is supposed to come to Australia and adopt to the Anglo-Saxon way of life and forget about their culture, their language, and so on and so forth. Now, this has considerably changed. And I think ever since 1980, and there are reasons for that anyhow, one of which is, of course, the anti-racist movement and the civil rights movement in the United States and so on and so forth. But without going into that trajectory, what happened is that state government and state official policy became much more accommodating of the idea of diversity and cultural pluralism and multiculturalism. I'm not saying it's the best policy we can hope for, but comparing to the highly chauvinistic, nationalistic, assimilationist perspective, it is much better, of course. Now, that's one. Second, because of globalization and the interconnectedness. Now, I mean, I am in Sydney. I can now go to the lounge room and open my Netflix TV service and watch the news. Not only Netflix on films and various films from the Arab world, but also through cable television. I can watch the news of any TV stations in Lebanon, and I'm really closely connected simultaneously with no time difference sometimes of what is happening in my country of origin, something which has not been possible prior to the 1990s and the globalization and the outcome of globalization and the interconnectedness that I referred to. So the world, we are becoming much more aware as migrants of what is happening at home, even though we are at a distance. Now, having said this, I believe that the answer to second generation and to diaspora can be better answered in a way. We have to bear in mind these developments in order to understand what is happening to the diaspora these days. In addition, something conjunctural in character ought to be added, i.e. when your country of origin is in crisis, the level of diasporic engagement rises. And when there is no crisis, you know, so hence the distinction between active diaspora and dormant diaspora. The dormant diaspora actually is brought to life, so to speak, and to activity when there is a crisis and when there is a problem back home. And definitely not every migrant is a member of diaspora, because diaspora, it's not an essentialist identity. Diaspora is, as Brew Baker has mentioned, is a practice. It's a claim that you make. It's a constructed practice. So if you are a migrant, but you're not interested at home and in home affairs, you may not be diasporic, engaged in diasporic activities. So migration does not make you diasporic automatically. It's your activity, it's your engagement and commitment that makes you so. Having said this, I would say that the second generation in Australia, at least from my own observation, is much more interested in home country and home affairs than previous times. In Australia, we have second and third and fourth generation. As a matter of fact, there are fourth generation as well who are interested. Now, let me also qualify this by saying that the more the state of origin shows interest in implementing diasporic policy, in reaching out to the diaspora, the more we have diasporic engagement, whether from first or second or third generation. And this also depends on, as I said earlier, and Bourdieusian analysis would allow us this because of the state role, you know, as an arbitrator, as an important, valorizer of what the diaspora is doing and what is not doing. So more interest, more reaching out, you may create more people who are connected and so on and so forth. So the question of connectivity is not to be thought in terms of essentialist terminology such as I am Lebanese versus non-Lebanese. My parents are Lebanese, but I'm not Lebanese. It has to be really gauged and analyzed in terms of activities and what is constructed and towards that activity directed at home and what is not constructed. So in that sense, I think one is better to analyze and answer the question that you have raised. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. I think we have time to have another round. We have another question. This time it comes from Aida Casanovas, who make clear that she has been in Lebanon. She says, Maraval, dear professor, and and also, she has been also grateful for some of your readings and so on. And she put some questions that I think particular to the Lebanese society and maybe how can we speak about diaspora for Lebanese society who is so divided, for instance. This kind of question, I think, makes sense. I just read the questions. I would like to ask to what extent we can speak about diasporic political remittances or any kind of remittances, given the fragmentation of the nation along she say, sects. Isn't a more united form of nation necessary to speak about in terms of political remittances between homeland and host country? I think, as she knows the Lebanese society, that's makes sense to speak about that because we know that the concept of diaspora necessarily requires the feeling of belonging to a community, and then from this point of view, maybe there are so many communities within the Lebanon that make sense this question. I have myself some questions. I don't know if I pose your question now or you want to answer this question before Ida.
I'll answer this question first.
Oh
if
yeah,
you don't mind.
yeah, because it's
I
broad.
find this. Thank you for asking this question again. I think it's very important, like the previous questions.
Yeah.
Yes, it is true that that Lebanon is fragmented along sectarian lines, but what is also true is that there is a state, and what is also true, each community wants to impose its own national version of what makes you Lebanese, taking into account its own sectarian interest. And you know, what I'm trying to say here is that despite the sectarian fragmentation in Lebanon, each community still sees itself in national terms, but the difference between let's say nationalism in Spain or nationalism in France and the nationalism in Lebanon in this case is that the nationalist version in classical national communities in Europe is much more, if you want, hegemonic and civil-based concept of nationalism, whereas in Lebanon, the concept of nationalism is restricted by communal version and communal projects for creating a central state. So no one particular community wants to be divided and form its own state versus other communities. So despite this, if you wish, differences and fragmentation, everybody wants Lebanon, but on his own terms. In that sense, yes, there are divisions within the diaspora, similar to the case of Lebanon, but each one, again, wants the diasporic remittances to feed into, if you wish, talking about the ruling elite and the fragmentation at the level of the ruling elite, each group wants to feed into, politically, into the corresponding group in Lebanon, which is trying to impose its sectarian version of the national identity over the others and subjugate the others accordingly, so to speak. So this is how I can, and in fact, I found Bourdieu's concept of field allowing for these divisions and for these competitions much more, and these dynamics, because it talks about how the diasporic field itself is an object of conflict, a site of contestation, so to speak. It is contested in terms of what constitutes the legitimate version of a good diasporic political remittances or a bad one. And in that sense, I think I found it very useful to capture this fragmentation and diversity within unity, if you wish. Not diversity, fragmentation within unity. so to speak. So then centripetal and centrifugal, I think, yeah, the dividing and the uniting forces are somehow intermingled in this process and dynamic.
Thank you, Paul. It was a way to say to Aida that maybe her question was national based on Western,
yes.
national based,
yes.
But a good opportunity to speak that the definition of diaspora is also sometimes national based, and we need to provide or the definition of diaspora. Maybe the Lebanese case give us the opportunity to think of diaspora in different terms.
Yes.
And I will say after the Jews, the concept of diaspora is Lebanese origin when you use it, because we know that the Lebanese country is one of the most diasporic country in the world, and then from this point of view, I think that's made clear. I have myself, as I see they are not questions. I will pose two questions that maybe could be also interesting for the debate and for the students and the audience. The first one is that you have been speaking about diaspora and transnationalism and make clear all these distinctions, but not about diaspora politics. That means that when the state promote diaspora, promoted remittances, there are different mechanisms to do that, but within the social remittances, there are also entrepreneurs. I have been myself working on transnational entrepreneurship, but analyze from the point of view of political. That means that the country of origin promoted this transnationalism, this feeling of belonging, and then promote diaspora feeling, because this is good for them, for the development of the country, and so on and so forth. You have not been speaking about that. That means that from the Lebanese case, there are not this kind of on the agenda of the political agenda. There is not this kind of promotion or what's happened. But because I think this view of the political side could also be complementary to your own perspective. This is my first question. My second question deals with Bourdieu terminology that I remember myself because I fully agree on the use of all the terminologies and so on, and that makes sense. Definitively, it's very useful analytically, and that makes sense. But I remember myself the insistence of Bourdieu that to understand Bourdieu, the category of social class is very important. It's very important. And all these categories of capital, champ, field, and all that means also that most of this kind of remittances may be used to reinforce a social class, but also for class mobility, which is very important. The concept of capital, one of the difference between the use of Bourdieu concept of capital in comparison to the American side, of social capital, cultural capital, and so on, is precisely because for Bourdieu, capital is one way to understand social mobility, and where it mixed power and inequality together. The category of power in the champ is very important, as you say, but also the category of inequality is very important. And then the relation between power and inequality is very important to him. And then I just wonder, taking into account that, where is the category of social class in your I think it is in the background, but it has not been visible in your lecture, and I think that makes sense also. Just to incorporate this dimension of social class, nothing more. Thank you for your lecture.
Well, thank you again for these important questions. As far as diasporic politics, yes, the state, especially in times of relative political stability, had embarked on diasporic policies in order to build bridges between it and the diaspora outside, and in order to mobilize the diaspora in support of activities favored by the state and the dominant ruling elite, the last of which is a project taken up by the infamous, by now he's very infamous, Minister for Foreign Affairs and Migrants, whose name is Gibran Bassil, who is the brother-in-law of the present president of Lebanon. He was at the time, prior to the current crisis, 2 years ago or so, he was the minister then, and he embarked on what he called Lebanese Diaspora Energy Conference. Wow. He conducted, many conferences led by the state and himself being present each time in different parts of the world, calling for Lebanese businessmen to invest in Lebanon and to allure them to deposit their capital in Lebanese banks, which they ended up being stolen anyhow, with high interest rate and so on and so forth. No, the state do, and there are also cultural activities reaching out to the diaspora, such as organizing by the state trips to second, third, and fourth generation to come to Lebanon, small numbers, but on a more or less regular base, to come to Lebanon during the summertime, and they guide them, take them on guided tours to see different sites and cultural sites in Lebanon and get familiar with Lebanon and so on and so forth. Of course, and entrepreneurship is the most important, emphasis by the state. They have actually created a special bureau attached to the prime minister in order to encourage investors of Lebanese background to come and invest in Lebanon, and they will be exempted for 2-3 years from paying tax, and all sorts of facilities are offered to them in order to come and invest in Lebanon. Yes, if you want, I can send you. I don't know if you know Jean-Michel Lafleur. Yes,
of course.
Yeah, I have contributed a chapter into his most recent actual publication on state activities, reaching out the Lebanese diaspora. So that's the first one. Regarding the class, you are right. It is important to bring out the class dimension. I completely agree with you that class mobility and class formation, if not considered, taken into account the role of migration, you will miss a lot on understanding class mobility and class structure in Lebanon. A lot. Because a lot of class mobility is due to migration, let alone the formation of political elite. I mean, the famous late Prime Minister Rafiq Hariri is a good example, which I mentioned in the paper notes. He was from a very poor background from Sidon, went overseas, made a huge amount of money, came back, converted his economic capital into political capital, and he, as a matter of fact, became not only a prime minister, but the first political leader of the Sunni community and then of Lebanon. When he was assassinated back in 2005, all over Lebanon came out and went down the streets in protestation against the Syrian, which led to their expulsion, physically at least, from Lebanon. So that how much important he was, and that importance and that role that he played, had it not been for migration, it wouldn't have been possible. But you see, as I mentioned earlier, and Bourdieu is of that opinion. Now, Bourdieu talks about, if you remember, he talks about two capital competing with one another in modern contemporary capitalist society, especially France, over their domination in the overall social order, the cultural capital and the economic capital. You know, and of course, he talks about the relationship between economic and culture, but sometimes he says you might be poor on the economic capital, but very rich on the cultural capital. Yeah. In Lebanon, sectarianism and class, I would say, sectarianism as a social capital and as a political capital struggles a lot with economic capital over the total domination of the social order. That is why it is so important to understand class mobility and sectarianism in Lebanon, because the framework within which class mobility or immobility is played out, is a sectarian framework. As I mentioned earlier, the richest person in Lebanon happened to be now known by Forbes magazine, Hariri and his son now, which is Saad al-Hariri, Mikati, who is the present prime minister now in Lebanon, Najib Mikati, and Muhammad Safadi. The three of them happen to have made their wealth from abroad. And the three of them, a good example of how strong is sectarianism politically, are Sunni leaders. And one of whom was, you know, the first Sunni leader, who is the late Rafiq Hariri. So class and sectarianism as a form of political capital and a form of social capital ought to be interconnected and understood.
Very interesting. Thank you for these wonderful answers, and that's allow us also to complement your lecture. I think we are all, myself, but I am sure students and the audience very satisfied to what they learn, they listen, and maybe also from my side, that's confirmed to my students, because I always insist in my course the importance of concepts and how the importance to connect the concept with empirical reality. You speak about measurability and so on, indicators and so on, but it is so important, this connection between concept and reality and empirical. And then I think your lecture make and reinforce my insistence on that, because this is precisely what we learn today in a concrete case of Lebanon and remittances with Australia and so on. And I have here my book on concept, contested concept in migration studies, and insist on that. It's just upper. And that we have not the concept of diaspora, but we have the concept of transnationalism inside. We cannot have all the concepts, but at least this idea that the concepts are very important in migration studies.
Please send me the full reference to that.
Okay, I will send you. It's just after this week. It has been just released now. I will send you all the references, but it was just a way to give more strength of your lecture on the importance of concept, transnationalism, diaspora, and so on and so forth, and the use of analytical tools to learn about the reality. Thank you very much for your intervention. Thanks also for the audience. I reiterate also the framework that has made possible this lecture is IEMed. I thank particularly Elisabetta for all the process, and Alba for today's technical issues. And I think I have nothing more to say. That maybe at one moment we will have your lecture also recorded, and hopefully will be also the possibility to listen you again from others and use it maybe for further courses. Thank you for all.
I would like, if you allow me, to say something. by way of ending this lecture. Thank you again for inviting me. Thank you for the opportunity to meet your student virtually. And let me emphasize that please, all students are welcome, and non-students are welcome to take further questions and the queries, and make some queries if you wish, by contacting me on my email, which is ptabar, P-T-A-B-A-R, @lau.edu.lb. Do not hesitate if you have any question to do so, or you want to discuss with me any ideas or something. I'm more than happy to respond to you. And thank you very much, Ricard. Thank you for IEMed program, and see you later.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your warm words, and nothing more to say. Thank you. Bye. Have a good dinner. I think it must be 10 o'clock or something like that, and now in Australia. Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.